Working the night shift at a gas station wasn't exactly a dream job, but it paid the bills. I'd been doing it for about 6 months. The hours were long, the customers were mostly drunks or truckers passing through, and the fluorescent lights gave everything a sickly glow. But it was quiet, and I didn't mind the solitude. Or at least I didn't used to. It was a Thursday night, or rather early Friday morning, around 2 a.m. The kind of time when the world feels like it's on pause. The station was at the edge of town, surrounded by nothing but dark, empty fields. No one else was around. The highway stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the darkness. I was the only one there, just me and the buzzing of the lights. The night had been uneventful, just the usual stream of half-asleep truckers and the occasional car. I was standing behind the counter, flipping through a magazine I'd read a dozen times before, when I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. The tires crunched on the gravel, and I looked up. It was an old, beat-up sedan, the kind that looked like it had seen better days. The headlights were dim, and the engine made a rattling noise as it idled. The driver didn't get out right away, which was odd. Most people either came in to pay or stayed in the car while they pumped gas. But this guy just sat there, the car still running. I watched for a minute, waiting for him to make a move. Nothing. The car just sat there, headlights pointing straight at the store, like eyes watching me. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I shook it off. Maybe he was just tired or looking for something in the car. Finally, after what felt like forever, the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He kept his head down as he walked toward the entrance. I couldn't see his face clearly, just the shadow of his cap and the outline of a scruffy beard. He pushed the door open and walked inside, the bell above the door jingling. The air felt colder as he entered, like he'd brought the night in with him. He didn't say anything, just walked over to the counter. I put on my best customer service smile, though something about this guy made my skin crawl. "Evening," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't respond, just stood there, staring at the counter. His hands were in his jacket pockets, and I noticed they were shaking slightly. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. I could feel my heart beating faster. "Can I help you with something?" I asked, my voice a little less steady than before. He finally looked up, just enough for me to see his eyes. They were bloodshot and wide, like he hadn't slept in days. His lips twitched, and for a second, I thought he might smile, but he didn't. Instead, he pulled one hand out of his pocket and placed it on the counter. There was something in his hand, something metal. My brain took a second to register what it was. A gun. A small, black pistol pointed right at me. My stomach dropped, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I'd never had a gun pointed at me before, never thought I would. This was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in a quiet gas station at the edge of town. "Empty the register," he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel. My hands shook as I reached for the cash drawer. My fingers fumbled with the keys, and I could barely get it open. I glanced up at him, hoping to see some hint of hesitation or regret, but his expression was blank, eyes still wide and staring. I pulled the bills out and handed them over, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. He snatched the money from my hand and stuffed it into his pocket. For a moment, I thought that was it, that he'd leave and this nightmare would be over. But he didn't move. He just stood there, the gun still pointed at me. The air was thick with tension, and I could barely think straight. "Please," I whispered, not even sure what I was asking for. He stared at me for what felt like an eternity, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out, the bell jingling again as he left. I didn't move until I heard the car door slam and the engine roar to life. I watched as the taillights disappeared down the highway, leaving me alone in the harsh light of the store. I stood there, still trembling, trying to process what had just happened. The night had returned to its quiet state, but I knew I'd never feel safe in that gas station again. The solitude I once enjoyed now felt like a trap, and the darkness outside seemed to press in closer than ever before. The next morning, I quit my job. I always thought working the night shift at the gas station would be boring. Just me, the hum of the fluorescent lights, and the occasional customer needing gas or snacks. But it's quiet out here on Route 89, especially after midnight. It's one of those places you drive past without noticing if you weren't almost out of gas. I've been working here for about 6 months, saving up for college. Most nights, I just read a book or watch some videos on my phone to kill time. Until last Thursday. It was a slow night like usual. The clock on the wall ticked past 1 a.m. when the bell above the door jingled. I looked up from my phone and saw a man walk in. He looked rough, dirty clothes, unshaven face, the kind of guy you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. But I've seen worse. It's a gas station in the middle of nowhere, after all. "Evenin'," I said, trying to sound casual. He didn't say anything, just nodded at me and headed toward the back of the store, where the drinks were. I watched him out of the corner of my eye while pretending to scroll through my phone. Something about him put me on edge, but I couldn't put my finger on it. He grabbed a beer from the cooler and walked up to the counter. As he placed it down, I noticed his hands were shaking. Not much, just a little tremor. I rang him up, but he didn't seem in a hurry to leave. He stood there, staring at me like he was trying to figure something out. "You need anything else?" I asked, hoping he'd take the hint and go. "Got a phone I can use?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly. "Sorry, no public phone here," I replied, nodding towards the payphone outside. "There's one out front if you got some change." He just stood there, not moving. His eyes, bloodshot and glassy, stayed locked on mine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "You okay, man?" I asked, trying to sound less nervous than I felt. He didn't answer. Instead, he just turned and walked out the door, leaving his beer on the counter. I watched through the window as he stood by the payphone, fumbling with something in his pocket. I couldn't see what he was doing, but he wasn't making a call. A few minutes passed, and another car pulled up to the pump. A couple got out. A man and a woman, both in their 30s, laughing about something. The guy went to fill up the tank while the woman came inside to pay. She smiled at me as she handed over her credit card, but the smile faded when she noticed the man outside by the payphone. "Everything all right out there?" she asked, glancing back at him. "Yeah, he's just, I don't know, acting weird," I replied, keeping my voice low. She looked at him again, then back at me. "Maybe we should just go," she said, sounding uneasy. I nodded. Probably a good idea. She took her receipt and hurried back to the car. As they drove off, I saw the man by the payphone watching them, his eyes following the car until it disappeared down the road. Then, he turned and walked back into the store. "You sure I can't use your phone?" he asked again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. I shook my head. "Sorry, man. Like I said, no public phone." He stood there, staring at me again, and I could feel the tension in the air. It was like we were both waiting for something to happen. Finally, he sighed, a deep, shuddering breath, and left without another word. He didn't even take his beer. I watched him walk away, heading down the road, not toward any car or house, just into the darkness. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread as I watched him disappear. I didn't know what his deal was, and I didn't want to find out. The rest of my shift passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When morning finally came, I was glad to clock out and leave. But the next night, when I came back from my shift, there was a cop car parked outside. My manager was there too, looking pale and shaken. I asked what was going on, and they told me. A body had been found about a mile down the road, in a ditch. A man. They said he looked like he'd been beaten to death, but they couldn't find any ID on him. They asked if I'd seen anything unusual the night before, and I told them about the man at the payphone. The cop nodded and thanked me, but as they drove off, I couldn't shake the feeling that I just missed something important. I never saw that man again, but I think about him every night when I work the graveyard shift. Sometimes I wonder if I should have let him use the phone, but then I remember those eyes, and I know I made the right call. But still, the memory of that night lingers, like a shadow that refuses to fade. A constant reminder that out here, in the middle of nowhere, you never really know who or what you're going to run into. I didn't want to take the night shift at the gas station, but I needed the extra cash. It was quiet most nights, and the worst thing I usually had to deal with was a customer too drunk to work the pump. But last Friday night was different. It's the kind of night that sticks with you, like a bad taste in your mouth. It was around 2 a.m. and I was the only one there. The gas station is just off a highway, surrounded by woods. We get a few truckers, some late-night travelers, but it's usually dead quiet at that hour. The fluorescent lights flickered every now and then, casting strange shadows in the corners of the store. I tried not to think about it too much. I was behind the counter, half asleep, when I saw headlights pulling into the station. The car was old, something from the 90s with paint chipping off. It rolled to a stop by pump 3, but no one got out. I waited for a minute, then another. Nothing. Maybe they're just tired, I thought, or maybe they fell asleep. I decided to go out and check. I grabbed the flashlight from under the counter, even though the lights out there were pretty bright. As I approached the car, I noticed the windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I tapped on the driver's side window with my knuckles, but there was no response. "Hey, you okay in there?" I called out, but still nothing. The car door suddenly opened. I jumped back, my heart pounding. A man stepped out. He was tall, wearing a heavy jacket, even though it was a warm night. His face was mostly hidden under the hood, but I could see his eyes, cold, empty, like he was looking right through me. "Sorry to bother you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just wanted to make sure you're all right." He didn't answer. He just stared at me for a long moment, then looked over at the store. I followed his gaze and saw another car pulling in. This one was newer, a shiny black sedan, parked at pump 1. The man finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "You should go inside." I didn't argue. There was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl. I hurried back into the store, locking the door behind me. The man stayed by his car, watching as the driver of the sedan got out. This guy was different, clean-cut, dressed in a suit. He didn't look like the type to be out here at this hour. The two men stood there, facing each other in the middle of the gas station. They didn't say a word, just stared each other down. The tension was so thick, I could feel it pressing against the glass of the door. I was about to pick up the phone to call the cops when I saw the man in the suit reach into his jacket. My heart stopped. I thought he was going to pull out a gun, but instead he pulled out an envelope. He handed it to the other guy, who took it without a word, then got back in his car. The man in the suit watched as the old car drove off. Then he turned and looked right at me through the store window. I froze. He started walking toward the door, and I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. When he reached the door, he tried to open it, but it was locked. He smiled, a cold, thin smile, and tapped on the glass. I didn't move, couldn't. After a moment, he shrugged and walked back to his car. He got in, started the engine, and drove off, disappearing into the night. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at the empty lot. Finally, I forced myself to move, to breathe. I unlocked the door, went outside, and looked around. There was no sign of the old car or the man in the suit, just the faint smell of exhaust hanging in the air. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I drove home, my hands shaking the whole way. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't want to know. I quit the next day. I don't need the money that bad. The thing is, I still think about it. Every time I drive past that gas station, I wonder what was in that envelope and why those two men met in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night. I have a feeling I'm better off not knowing, but it doesn't stop the questions from coming. And it doesn't stop the nightmares.